Hello, Assalamu alaikum everybody, hope you're all safe, sound and healthy. And this was supposed to be a part two, which I felt was much needed um, with regards to, the whole PIMS hospital fire slash potential arson case. And I did so much research on, because I wanted to explain my, previous statements, in the first part where I talked about how having locked doors like this is problematic because generally you have magnetic auto locked doors, but not the way it is or the way it has been in PIMS, where the neonatal ward was locked from the outside and that there was no completely no access. And I wanted to explain that further, but unfortunately, I got to listen to Dr. Mohit Pirzada's vlog, and so I scrapped it. So I might do a brief pointer, just because I, after all, was planning on doing it anyway, but I wouldn't go into so many details. For that, I would say just listen to him. Although it's in Urdu, but I'm sure there is a subbing, dubbing facility in his vlog. So yeah. This is why, I try not to listen to people, and I first make my own podcast, and after that, I listen to people. But unfortunately, it just happened that I was listening to him, and I noticed that he was mentioning many of the details. Okay, I'll go on with my other parts of research that I was doing, which was where I felt part two was needed, and that was to further explain how and why the vulnerable of the society are used to create tragedies in order to move public, to move public motions or to move public sentiment in order to make them accept or agree to whatever it is that you want them to agree to pass. For example, bills that normally wouldn't be allowed to pass. And this is again something that I've actually talked about so many times in my in my podcast, again in the past, way back when nobody was talking about it years ago, when I kept on and on, especially focusing on 9/11, saying how they wanted the Patriot Act bill to be passed, where they wanted to encroach upon the privacy laws. They wanted to revoke privacy laws and, and also collection of data mining, everything. It all comes under that at one point, at some point, in any case. So, yeah. And that is, again, when, again, I even in those podcasts, I also mentioned Vietnam, and how when people found out the truth, or Iraq, and how they created that narrative of WMDs, which was absolutely false. And again, it was to silence the people so that they could allow the government to attack Iraq. And similarly, the whole 9/11 charade was to silence the people so that they could allow their government to attack other countries, and to use their proxies like Pakistan, for potential wars and conquests. So, yeah, I mean, as I've said before, throughout history, governments and military forces have repeatedly weaponized, starved, or engineered crises around their most vulnerable citizens to consolidate political control or crush domestic dissent. And these actions demonstrate how rulers have historically treated their own populations as collateral damage or direct targets to maintain power. For example, if we look at manufactured famines and resource deprivation, regimes have frequently controlled food and vital resources to eliminate restive populations under the guise of state building or economic reform, which again is something I talked extensively about whenever I told you, watch out for what your governments are doing, and especially what your army is doing. If they're beginning to hoard resources, or if they are making it of the utmost importance to desubsidize or to restrict or to supply of what is otherwise your everyday utility. And if they begin to, for example, increase the bill and say, oh, you're going to have a fixed charge of for example, £2,000 or 2,000 rupees, which you have to pay surcharge no matter what, fixed charges, whether you're using that utility or not, so look out for these, because then you know that they're actually up to something, because they are preparing for, again, another potential massive war or conquest or whatever it is that they're up to. So, as I said, you can trace it all the way back to basically even, his colonial history or even pre-colonial history, when the dynasties, and how when two powerful houses, or on either side of the kings, for example, would fight for their power, they would time and again use natural disasters to create more disasters, to again target vulnerable people, so that they can amass more power, or gain more say in the royal court, for example. We've seen that constantly. But if you want to come a little further down to years that you can sort of associate with, then apart from the Vietnam situation, which I will again repeat anyway, which I've done a million times, we have the Cambodian genocide. I might even repeat some of those that I talked about in the previous part, just to maintain that that historical the chain, and to add a little more details if needed. Okay, so the Cambodian genocide, for example, which was from 1975 to 1979, where the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, sought to create a classless agrarian utopia to achieve absolute control. They targeted urban populations, ethnic minorities, and intellectuals. Millions of vulnerable citizens were forced into rural labor camps, resulting in nearly 2 million deaths from executions, starvation, and overwork on the killing fields. Yes, they were called killing fields because the people just died like flies in those labor camps. Then we have the scorched earth and counterinsurgency warfare. When fighting internal rebellions, militaries often use strategy that purposefully destroys civilian hold on a second. Yeah, sorry, I wanted to go into details about how scorched earth works in counterinsurgency. So I thought maybe I should go a little more into detail. Because this is something that I literally was just talking about. So I thought that I should give it a proper, its proper name, so that that it actually has a name. When I was talking about resource denial and population relocation, infrastructural leveling. For example, basically how scorched earth works in counterinsurgency is armies will destroy local crops, livestock, and water supplies, so irregular fighters cannot find food or shelter, basically civilians, so when the military wants to gain control, right? Then you have population relocation. Governments sometimes force civilians out of rural areas into controlled camps or fortified zones to cut off the local support base for guerrillas. Infrastructure leveling. Roads, bridges, and villages are ruined to limit the movement and communication networks of insurgents. Now, the strategic dilemmas and legality becomes very pronounced in such movements. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because the military may claim to be doing such things in, for example, KPK, in Balochistan, in probably various areas of Punjab. They might start doing that. They've already probably started it or done quite a number of it in Sindh in the past, even in Punjab, for all we know. And in Kashmir right now, because the first act of insurgency, and now that's the problem, is that they've officially referred to it as an insurgency, where the Kashmiris now attacked the military in Kashmir, which obviously is not insurgency, because the army marched into Kashmir and they attacked the civilians, and now the civilians have decided that the offensive will be their new defensive, but the army will label it as insurgency, much as the Indian army did in occupied Kashmir. You understand? So that's why I'm mentioning this in detail, because for example, the population problem occurs. Insurgencies rely on local population for cover, food, and intelligence. Scorched earth tactics try to break this bond by making life unsustainable in contested regions. And that is a problem I'm talking about, because, as I said, we have seen India do that to occupied Kashmir, and we have seen our military do that to Balochistan, and in certain areas of KPK they have been trying to do that, and now Kashmir is probably next. So the counterproductive effect, as we know, is that they're destroying civilian livelihoods, and this often drives non-combatants to join the rebellion out of anger or desperation, which strengthens the insurgency over time. And according to the 1977 Geneva Conventions, the international law that we have here, it strictly bans attacking or destroying objects essential for the survival of the civilian population, such as drinking water supplies and agricultural areas, to starve or displace civilians. You understand? So there is that matter that we have at hand. Because when fighting internal rebellions, militaries often use strategy that purposefully destroys civilian infrastructure to strip insurgents of their support base, right? So that actually is very counterproductive. And as I said, that the reason I'm talking about it is because our military is actually using any and every of these tactics that they can get their hands on, which is again something that you do not use against your own people, but they are declaring civilians insurgents or guerrillas, and then they are creating false flag operations where they're attacking the vulnerable, and just to strengthen, so they think that they're strengthening their narrative and that the people will be on their side, but actually the way things are unfolding, people are not on their side, despite all of these efforts, which are just costing more lives, and they're costing more bloodshed, and it's actually just creating more rebellion factors. Let's move on to another example of how governments have created chaos and tragedies in order to maintain control. We have the Spanish Reconstruction policy of 1896, just to suppress the Cuban War of Independence. The Spanish general Valeriano Weyler forced the rural Cuban population into fortified reservation camps called reconcentrados, or if I go a bit wild, I'll say reconcentrados. Okay, so they're basically reservation camps. Okay, lacking food, medicine, and sanitation. Over 100,000 vulnerable citizens, or civilians you can say, died of disease and starvation, and this was a tactic designed to strip rebels of rural support. Now imagine, and then you have the Strategic Hamlet program of 1962, which again, we're going back to the Vietnam War. The South Vietnamese government, backed by the US military, forcibly relocated millions of rural peasants into fortified camps. The goal was to isolate the population from communist insurgents, but it uprooted vulnerable agrarian communities, destroyed their livelihoods, and deeply alienated the civilian population. So The thing is, as if you've heard other people in their vlogs, or if you've heard, even Shahbaz Gill, and, he has actually mentioned that, and I'm coming back, yes, it may sound disconnected, but I'm coming back to this PIMS fire, incident, because, you must have seen that they told you that this wasn't the first of its kind. It obviously wasn't the first of its kind in Pakistan, especially, because this fire, which broke out in the third floor nursery of the mother and child health ward, it killed, as we know, 14 newborn babies, right? After which oxygen connections rapidly accelerated the flames. That's the story, okay? Relatives reported that the locked ward doors, a lack of functional emergency protocols, and delayed rescue operations trapped the infants inside. This I covered in my previous part, right? Now, the thing is that historically and regionally, as I said, there have been several striking parallels where systematic negligence or localized safety failures in medical facilities cost the lives of those entirely unable to protect themselves. I think Dr. Shahbaz Gill mentioned the Sahiwal Teaching Hospital fire, which occurred in 2024. But that's because this comes as a direct regional parallel, where a catastrophic fire just tore through the whole pediatric ward of Sahiwal Teaching Hospital, and the incident was similar to the initial reporting at PIMS. A faulty air conditioning unit sparked a fire that quickly engulfed the nursery, which again kind of creates suspicions that, oh, how is it the exact same thing happened? It actually adds to your suspicions. Because the consequences was that 11 newborn babies lost their lives in that tragedy, and it exposed severe oversight in medical equipment maintenance, leading to the immediate arrest. Here's where the difference starts, because it led to the immediate arrest of the senior hospital doctors and administrators for criminal negligence. Then you have the Ahmednagar hospital fire, which occurred in Maharashtra, India, in November 2021, and this incident actually highlights the global issue of administrative failure transforming intensive care spaces into death traps for vulnerable patients. If you look into the incident, again, it was a fire that broke out in the newborn intensive care unit, which was the NICU of a district hospital, fueled heavily by air conditioning units and inadequate ventilation. And 11 infants died from smoke inhalation. Subsequent safety audits revealed that the hospital lacked a functional fire compliance certificate, had no working sprinkler systems, and the staff were completely untrained for emergency evacuations. This was something that I was trying to talk about in my previous part when I said that, that even in England and France and other places, especially if you look into the retail, if you look at the buildings where you have retail, where you have shops and everything, if you look at their emergency exits, they are also actually basically locked, and they're so heavy, but they're rigged. As I said, there you can see wires, they're rigged to wires so that it can enable and also, as I said, because over there is this thing where you have a drill. There's always a drill, so there's always a designated day where you have to have a fire drill, so that is where you simulate that there is, and a non-existent, incident. You sort of have a simulation where you think that, oh, there's a fire, and you do the whole drill. Anybody who lives abroad knows what I'm talking about. So it's a fire emergency and exit drill that you do, okay? So in those times, you kind of go through the motions of how you have to make sure to unlock the door, keep it open, but otherwise their exit doors are also usually locked, by the way. Then you have the Baghdad COVID-19 ward fire, which occurred obviously in Iraq in April 2021. That is when that was a good example of actually systematic state breakdown with corruption, So that 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 was the consequence of you know these two things joining together. Now the research that I was doing and that I kind of scrapped was basically about the International Hospital Safety Codes for NICUs, which, as I said, that when I started listening to Dr. Mohit Pirzada, I was like, okay, he's already talking about stuff that is very, very similar to this, so I don't need to get into this. So I kind of scrapped it, and then I thought, hang on, I did all my research. I can at least briefly, put it out there. Basically, the high-risk nature of newborn facilities means that international standards such as the National Fire Protection Association, which is the NFPA, 101 Life Safety Code, and Joint Commission International JOI guidelines mandate specific physical protections designed to combat the exact hazards that failed at PIMS hospital. Okay? Number one, you have the defend in place architecture. Because infants cannot self-evacuate, modern NICUs are legally required to be built as independent fire and smoke compartments. They must feature fire-rated walls and doors capable of resisting a direct blaze for 1 to 2 hours, allowing staff time to manage life support systems rather than forcing an immediate chaotic run into a burning hallway. The second point was automatic oxygen shutoff valves. International codes mandate localized zone valve boxes located right outside the nursery. So in the event of a fire, staff can pull a single lever to instantly cut the flow of pressurized medical oxygen to that specific room, stopping a fire from becoming an uncontrollable oxygen accelerated explosion. The third point, fail-safe electromagnetic locks. This is what I was talking about in part one, actually, and this is why I wanted to go into details. You see, as I said, while baby abduction prevention requires controlled access, modern safety codes strictly prohibit manual padlocks or standard deadbolts. Wards must use electromagnetic locks tied directly to the building's fire alarm system. So the second a smoke detector is triggered, power to the doors cuts out automatically, instantly unlocking them for rescuers. This is what I was saying, that the doors are wired, they're electromagnetic. Even the exits, yes, even the exit doors that are on regular normal days normally kept locked, but they are wired, so they're electromagnetic. Now, obviously, as we know, administrative accountability went out the window this time. So what is it that the public outrage is right now at its peak is that we want accountability and we're not getting it. Why? That in itself again adds to the suspicion. The fact that they do not want to sack anybody, and the fact that, as I said, this is three birds, one stone, where you will see somebody from the army officially take over. And we're already hearing of this retired captain who has come and set up tent, and he's putting a whole show, a whole drama, but he wasn't even there. He set up the tent and claimed that he would be there, but he wasn't even there for a long time. I don't know if he came or not. But the thing is that he is a retired captain. That is the key point that I'm trying to make here. I don't care if anybody made that or not, okay? Now, if we get back to, again, why this suspicion of mine was, is going to continue regardless of the fact, no matter what evidence they bring in, and as I said, the mothers of the children and the witnesses they are on the same page as I am. We have so many instances where elites connected to the establishment or the government, they also create disasters, or they they use natural disasters and add to that, For example, like the floods that occurred last year in India and Pakistan, the fact that Himachal and Punjab were extremely, you know, you know, almost destroyed because of the floods. They were, and it hit many parts of Punjab in Pakistan that normally wouldn't actually be hit so severely. And we kept on saying it was man-made. It was man-made because every year you have monsoon. Every year you know where your flooding is supposed to go, and then you know that over there the Indian government ensured that all the flood gets concentrated on certain parts of Himachal and Punjab. And over here you find out that your military was also making sure to safeguard some elite people's farmhouses and lands, and they diverted the floods into where the poor people in the village lived, and they destroyed their homes. The poor people, the lower middle class and the middle class, right? So that's what happened. They destroyed their farms, their homes, and so this is called man-made. So when there is a natural occurrence and then you turn it into an even bigger disaster, although you could actually have made sure that it was never a disaster, And as we know, like for example, the cutting down of the trees in Islamabad so that they can have their illegal urban planning, again, the army. So, and we remember the LA fires, which was supposed to be deliberate. So let's see again how far that goes. Because, for example, there's, land seizure via accidental, and I'm quoting here, accidental, I'm making air quotes, accidental fires, like the Weibo and slum clearances. We're looking at the global patterns here, okay? So in the realm of real estate and urban development, the use of accidental fire to displace vulnerable populations without paying legal compensation is a well-documented phenomenon. So how does it work? What's the mechanism? When governments or elite real estate developers want to build a high-end commercial district, luxury high-rises or infrastructure, they face a legal hurdle. The thousands of low-income families or laborers living in dense slums or protected historical buildings refuse to move. So what's the reality? Across several developing mega cities in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, notably documented in periods of rapid expansion in Southeast Asia and parts of Latin America, devastating fires would suddenly break out in these settlements in the dead of the night. Because the structures were made of wood and lacked fire infrastructure, hundreds of families, including children and the elderly, perished or were left homeless. The elite gain. Within days of the accidental blaze, again, I'm using air quotes for accidental. Before an investigation could even begin, municipal governments would swiftly declare that the area, was a safety hazard, and then zone it for commercial redevelopment, hand the land over to elite real estate conglomerates, and the fire bypassed years of eminent domain court battles. The next is the drafted pretext to kill civilians. Operation Northwoods, remember I talked about it in part 1, which was United States 1962, because this was one of the most starkly documented instances of a government body formally planning to, kill and displace civilians, and as if you remember, Kennedy rejected it. And then if you look at exploiting vulnerable children for legislation, because, as I said, one of the arguments that people made when I said that this to me looks to be deliberate, they're like, would they be so cruel as to harm children? And in part 1, as I said, I've talked about how these people are actually very infamous, especially the American governments and the European royalties and all. They're very infamous for doing a lot of cannibalistic and heinous stuff, especially to children. So, if you look at the early modern foundling scams, the 18th and 19th century Europe, state corruption and if you look at that, right? So state corruption and elite financial fraud frequently targeted abandoned infants. Governments and wealthy elites established foundling hospitals and private care nurseries, ostensibly to care for the surge of illegitimate or impoverished newborns. However, these facilities were deeply tied to state-sanctioned financial syndicates. So, in many cases, elites skimmed the massive tax allocations and charitable funds meant to feed and house these infants. When overcrowding caused horrific localized outbreaks of disease or accidental, again air quotes, accidental structural fires, the high infant mortality rates were publicly dismissed as the, and I'm quoting here, unfortunate reality of weak-born children. You see why I'm talking about this stuff with regards to the PIMS fire case? Because in reality, administrative bodies routinely allowed these tragedies to occur or worsened the conditions intentionally. They would then use the shocking accidental death tolls to shock Parliament into passing aggressive new tax bills or restructuring public land management, enriching the very oligarchs running the corrupt system. So historically, the pattern remains consistent, right? When an elite group views a segment of the population as legally exposed or physically helpless, accidents frequently become a highly effective, low risk, factor, that gets played in. It's just easier because they're already vulnerable. I think I talked about the Duplessis orphan scandal, which occurred in the 1950s in Quebec, Canada, in part 1. Maybe I didn't go into detail. I wouldn't mind repeating it, because this case, it represents a highly calculated institutional conspiracy targeting vulnerable children strictly for financial profit and legal restructuring. Okay, so it was dubbed the Duplessis orphans scandal, right? Basically in the 1940s and 50s, the government of Quebec under Premier Maurice Duplessis, or I think if it's French it will be Duplessis, but anyway, so Maurice Duplessis realized a loophole in federal funding. The Canadian government provided a much higher daily subsidy for patients in psychiatric hospitals than for children in orphanages. So, to exploit this, the provincial government, in collusion with certain religious authorities running the orphanages, systematically reclassified over 20,000 perfectly healthy orphan children as mentally ill. Yes, they declared them mentally ill. And what did the elite gain from this? The orphanages were instantly converted into mock psychiatric institutions. The children were subjected to horrific medical experiments, straitjackets, and severe abuse, leading to countless undocumented deaths. The provincial government and church bodies successfully extracted millions in federal funding, using the absolute legal vulnerability of parentless children to balance budgets and enrich institutional coffers. If you want to go even further, we can go to the Great Fire of Rome, 64 AD, because this was the earliest, most famous historical archetype of a ruler allegedly engineering a mass casualty disaster to bypass real estate laws. So what was it all about? Basically, a catastrophic fire broke out in the dense working class slums of Rome, burning for over 6 days, killing hundreds and leaving hundreds of thousands homeless. The vulnerability factor here is the poor lived in cheap wooden multi-story insulae, which were apartment blocks that lacked any fire safety infrastructure, making the area a tinderbox. So while historians still debate his direct involvement, Roman historians like Suetonius and Tacitus famously recorded the widespread public belief that Emperor Nero intentionally ordered the fires to be set or let them burn. Nero had desperately wanted to build a massive 100-acre palace complex called the Domus Aurea, which was a golden house. But the land was tightly packed with low-income housing and protected property. So immediately after the so-called accidental blaze cleared the land, Nero seized the real estate, bypassed property laws, and built his monument. Then we have the Chiquita brands, which is also known as the Banana Massacre fires. It occurred in the early 20th century in Colombia. Basically, corporate monopolies working hand in hand with state militaries have frequently manufactured chaotic situations to crush labor reforms and protect real estate assets. And this was that case in particular. The United Fruit Company, now Chiquita Brands, owned vast swaths of land in Colombia when thousands of low-income workers went on strike demanding basic healthcare, toilet facilities, and safety compliance. The corporate elites successfully pressured the Colombian government to step in. So they manufactured a crisis. And what was that? The military opened fire on a peaceful crowd of workers. Does that sound familiar, people? Pakistan, Zindabad. Yeah, so the military opened fire on a peaceful crowd of workers and their families in a public square to cover up the scale of the massacre and protect the corporation's international image. The bodies, including women and children, were quickly loaded onto trains and dumped into sea or buried in unmarked mass graves. Something that we know that Pakistani military has been doing. They did it in Islamabad massacre, they did it in Muridke. In fact, even in this PIMS fire incident, it is said that the bodies cannot be found of the babies. And in Kashmir as well, they have tried to, take over and hide the bodies. They've been doing the same in Balochistan as well. So, and then, then they're like, oh, where are the bodies? Where are the bodies? Tell us. There's no dead bodies. You tell us. You're lying. So this is something that as I said, our military has been doing consistently now for these past 2 to 3 years. So what was the elite gain in that crisis? The government and the company publicly blamed the violence on communist rioters who had caused an accidental escalation. The terrorists successfully broke the strike, dissolved the labor unions, and allowed United Fruit to pass highly restrictive land use and labor policies that kept their massive corporate real estate holdings incredibly profitable for decades. After all, that's why they still exist as the Chiquita brand, right? Then there's the Chinatown fires and exclusion acts, United States, late 19th century. During periods of intense anti-immigrant sentiment, municipal governments and wealthy property developers frequently used accidental fires to cleanse prime real estate of vulnerable immigrant communities. In cities like San Jose, California, 1887, and Honolulu, Hawaii. This is particularly why I chose to discuss it, because I wanted to talk about Hawaii. As you know, I've referenced Hawaii in the past in my podcasts. So 1900, the Honolulu, Hawaii, breakout was in the 1900, and then basically what happened is that in these two cities, the Chinese immigrant populations occupied dense, valuable downtown real estate, and white property syndicates desperately wanted the land for commercial development but were blocked by existing tenancies. So let's take San Jose, for example. In San Jose, a massive fire mysteriously broke out and completely leveled Chinatown just days after the city council declared it a public health nuisance. In Honolulu, the Board of Health ordered a controlled burn of a few buildings to combat the bubonic plague. The fire was allowed to escape control, completely wiping out Chinatown and rendering 4,500 people homeless. One would think this was more than just about real estate. It was basically about eradicating Chinatown, because if you remember, there were anti-Chinese sentiments in those times. So in both instances, the municipal governments immediately banned the displaced vulnerable residents from rebuilding on their own land, citing public safety and new zoning ordinances. The property was quickly sold to wealthy developers for high-end commercial use, using the guise of public emergency to execute mass displacement. If you go to the Reichstag fire and the Decree for the Protection of People and State, which occurred in Germany in 1933, you will see that this is the definitive historical archetype of a political regime using a sudden structural catastrophe to dismantle a democracy. Again, the reason why I chose it. The German public's collective sense of safety, specifically blaming vulnerable political dissidents, immigrants, and communists, was the target, okay? And the incident occurred on February 27, 1933. The Reichstag building, the German parliament, was severely damaged by an arson attack. Doesn't that sound familiar to you too? Now, the newly appointed Chancellor Adolf Hitler and his party immediately declared it a communist conspiracy aimed at overthrowing the state. The very next day, Hitler used the panic to pressure President Paul von Hindenburg into signing the Reichstag fire decree. This law suspended key civil liberties, including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to assembly. It allowed the regime to arrest political rivals without charge, effectively liquidating the democratic opposition and locking in absolute dictatorial control. Yeah. Doesn't this remind you of May 9th, Lahore, Pakistan, about 3 years ago? Yeah. Now, here's another instance. This is again the instance that I just talked about, the Duplessis. But this is not exactly that, but it is related to that. This was basically the dead souls and electoral engineering of the Duplessis era, okay? If you remember, that was the name of the then politician. And this is again Quebec, Canada. Expanding on the exploitation of institutionalized populations, vulnerable citizens with zero societal voice have been used directly to rig democratic systems. Remember the orphans scandal, the Duplessis orphans scandal. So basically, orphaned children, psychiatric patients, and the illiterate poor were the targets, right? And during the mid-20th century elections in Quebec, the ruling political machine systematically used the identities of the highly vulnerable, including those inside state-run asylums and orphanages, to manipulate voter turnout. Political operatives routinely cast fraudulent ballots under the names of deceased patients. Again, this has been happening in Pakistan consistently for decades, as we know. And disenfranchised orphans or institutionalized individuals who had no legal capacity or physical ability to protest. By weaponizing these dead souls or completely dependent populations, the regime manufactured thousands of proxy votes, ensuring their political survival and blocking reformist opposition parties from gaining power. And as I said, this is how PPP and PMLN in Pakistan have consistently been getting their votes over the decades. Now, there is also the strategic neglect of the Irish potato famine, which people constantly talk about, which occurred between 1845 and 1852, when basically this was when the government wished to permanently alter the political and demographic landscape of a rebellion region, right? In this case, Ireland. Doing nothing during a crisis is often a deliberate political strategy, and that is what they did. The impoverished agrarian Catholic population of Ireland were the target. A natural blight wiped out Ireland's primary food source, the potato crop. However, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, which was at that time the wealthiest empire on earth. So the British administration, heavily influenced by political economists who viewed the Irish peasantry as lazy, overpopulated, a barrier to a modern capitalistic economy, they used the famine to achieve a permanent political and economic shift. They refused to halt massive food exports, such as grain and livestock, out of Ireland, while the locals starved. Again, doesn't that sound familiar? Over here, what did they do with the wheat? What did they do with the sugar? Yeah. Charles Trevelyan, the colonial administrator in charge of relief, explicitly stated that the famine was a mechanism for reducing surplus population. The political gain was the near total destruction of the Irish agrarian political resistance through death and mass immigration, fundamentally reshaping land ownership in favor of British elites. Then, if you remember in part 1, I mentioned the 1999 Russian apartment bombings, so I will not go into details of that. But I would like to mention the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, because the history of famines in India under British colonial rule provides some of the most extensively documented historical accounts where vulnerable populations were treated as collateral damage to protect elite economic interests and advance wartime geopolitics. So while natural drafts initially triggered these crises, the resulting catastrophes were heavily manufactured and sustained by deliberate colonial policy decisions. And as we know, following its victory at the Battle of Buxar, the British East India Company gained the right to collect land revenues over Bengal. And so in 1769, when a harsh drought led to widespread crop failures, putting millions of peasant farmers at risk, rather than easing financial burdens during this crisis, the company actively raised land taxes to ensure their corporate profit margins remained stable. Furthermore, they banned the hoarding of rice by locals, while company officials cornered the market to sell grain back to the starving population at exorbitant, hyperinflated prices. Again, as I said, look at the exact same pattern being repeated through the wheat harvesting, through the sugar hoarding and exporting, and then over-exporting, and then re-importing it back for triple the price. This is something Nawaz Sharif has always done, by the way. He has always done that. Every single time they come into the government, they always do that, without any exception. There was the great famine of 1876 and 1878, which was the temple wage. This affected large swaths of southern and western India. And then because at that time, while over 5.5 million Indians were actively starving, Lytton oversaw the export of a record 320,000 tons of wheat to England to fuel the British domestic economy. So, to curb state expenses, the British Famine Commissioner Sir Richard Temple instituted the infamous Temple wage. This policy mandated that to receive a minimal food ration, starving Indians had to perform hard labor at relief camps. About 5.5 to 10 million people perished, by the way, while the colonial administration successfully, they out welfare costs and protected British trade networks. So then there was also the Bengal famine of 1943, which occurred during World War II, which is extremely notorious, and people have talked about it a lot, where Winston Churchill instituted a denial policy. that famous denial policy, you know. So the military confiscated and destroyed tens of thousands of rural Bengali boats and entire rice stocks in coastal areas to prevent them from potentially falling into Japanese hands, you know. That was their narrative. This completely shattered the local transport and food distribution networks. When the famine set in, then the British government repeatedly denied requests to divert wheat shipments to India, instead stockpiling grain for European civilians and soldiers. As I said, you can see this repeated over and over again within Pakistan alone, within these past few decades, by the same people over and over again, the same governments, by Nawaz Sharif and his family and his government, by Zardari's family and his government, by the military. The same people over and over again. So, yes, the PIMS hospital, yeah, I'm sorry, I will still stand by my words. As I said, even in a place like Pakistan, mashallah, mashallah, buildings don't catch fire easily. No, they don't. No matter what you try to say about shoddy construction, about it can never be as shoddy as it is in America. That much I can assure you. Because over here, bricks and mortar is used. You know, you use bricks to build buildings. You don't use wood. You don't have drywalls. You know, you make foundations. You make your homes. Everything's on brick and cement. You know, and then the wiring is within the walls, which I personally find to be very, very, you know, it's very, very, it's not very pragmatic in the long run, you know, seriously, because like, what are you supposed to do if you want to change your whole wiring? You'll have to go all external, you know what I mean? So yeah, but anyway, point being, over here, shoddy is a different kind of shoddy. It's not the kind of shoddy that's going to cause you fires. I don't care what, as I said, the story is identical to the Sahiwal incident, which again just ups my suspicion, you know, 10 times more. So have a think, okay? Go through history yourselves. Look at even Joseon, as in the Joseon era. Look at the old Japanese era. Whenever there are, even today, if you look at Europe and if you look at the past, if you look even, you know, not just at colonies, but people, countries when they were under, you know, their own royal families and dynasties, every time there are two parties fighting for power, they will use public livelihood, they will use natural disasters, they will use public lives as collateral damage. And military, all over the world, intelligence communities and military, they are notorious for always using human lives as collateral damage. And the more vulnerable you are, as I said in part 1, the more vulnerable you are in the society, the greater the impact. And so the more control they can have over public sentiment or over public emotion or over driving, you know, them to the point where they want them to be. As I said, chaos brings order. That is the way they are trained to think. So they have to bring about chaos to bring about their kind of order in which they maintain control. This is me signing out. Khuda Hafiz.